We should have ELTE.
Aaron with
Okay, then Belgrade B.
Stefan speaking first. Either mine or he.
Okay, and then looping A. Marketing first. Great. So, Jack, a little bit to do the timing. So, as per the other rounds, there will be a ban about 1 minute, something like this. That means that you can and should have some points of information to the side. Similar ban for 6 minutes, meaning you can't and shouldn't. 7 minutes, there'll be 2 bangs, meaning you come to the end of your allotted time, start wrapping things up. 7 minutes 15 or so, there'll be more bangs, but we've all put our pens out at that point, so there's no point saying anything else. Does anyone have any questions about that stuff? Any questions about anything else? Great, so let's begin round A. The motion before the House today is that this House believes that microfinance organisations, including but not limited to, non-governmental organisations, charities and development banks, should offer microfinance loans in developing nations exclusively to women. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister down here to present the case that stands here today.
We think that microfinance companies, like almost anything, has a decision to make over scarce resources and how they allocate them in the most efficient way possible to deliver the best results. We think this is only ever going to be done by allocating strictly to women in terms of delivering the best results for the individuals as well as the best result economically as a whole. So very simple model of, well, the words in the motion where we're just giving straight to women, excluding men. So what I'm going to talk about, the ways in which women are excluded through other economic means, and therefore the impact of that, and then how we go about changing this. But first, what do we think the comparative in this debate actually is? We think that women are the choices. You see men who don't get microfinance, who, although they don't then get to maybe start a company guaranteed, will still have other economic routes to earning an income, maybe less than if they got the microfinance. The women who get this in their stead, though, have almost no economic alternative to this, where they are probably going to become an economically redundant unit, say, are going to be starting traditional domestic forms of roles. We think this is the comparative where they then get a business. So there's much greater benefit to them than to letting men who have other opportunities get forward. We think this applies in clarification, yeah.
Can you please give us some context whether what developing countries you're talking about, in terms of how high levels of development?
We're applying this in every instance of microfinance, so that's any place microfinance happens. Okay, so we think that's just most developing countries. So we think that women, even in countries where they do have some economic alternatives, their economic alternatives are far less than the men. So that's in the comparative. So you get far more results from them than men. So why are women excluded? Firstly, because while the main alternative is, if you are poor and therefore seeking microfinance, is to go about things like manual labour. I think women are going to be systemically excluded from this market because they're seen as unable to actually go about doing this work. So you think they have no other option there and can't seek a job in that form. I think men can. Therefore, men have some higher comparative income than if they can't go about doing this. Also, we think that the poor groups in the society aren't going to have much education, but the men are always going to have that bit more, because when you have probably larger families in these areas, which you think generally happens, they make a decision as to which children they want to educate, and they'll put any investment in education or early years development into the male child because they think they're going to be the one most economically productive. So the male child always goes in with a greater advantage in terms of education, so will always be able to get some level of better economic alternative. I think that's generally the case. And finally, traditional sources of finance. Any money they get from the family, any potential savings, those kind of things that could be built up, always left to the oldest son generally, but any male sibling children rather than the women. This means that the men will always have some level of finance, potentially greater level of finance, to the women to go about pursuing this. So you think women won't be earning, going to be going about that much. So what's the damage here? If you allow women to become less productive units in society, firstly, they are seen as far less empowered in society because people generally define others' worth by their ability to contribute to their family and those kind of things. And the problem is the traditional work, such as the mother's work that they may be pigeonholed into, is often seen as far less valuable and just a thing that women do. So they are never going to be viewed as valuable based on that, and therefore are always discouraged from going to get further jobs. Moreover, we think that it generally leads to them being able to earn less, but the overall society and the economy is massively damaged. Why is this? Because when you have units in society who are unable to work, unable to deliver the most reward for you, I think that's generally quite damaging. Why does this end up happening? Because we don't think that some microfinance leads to massively successful companies, but generally it's a small amount of income, probably greater than you would have otherwise. Many of the traditional options are things such as being able to recycle metals you find around, being able to do that as business and sell them on. You probably earn more than you otherwise would by doing this. What's important about that? It allows the development of local economies that allow you to buy from a local trader a bit more, that allows them to maybe pay you more. You start to build up those local economies that start to see more demand and more potential jobs for these women created. So that's why we think it matters, because we think it ultimately delivers the best development. I think this is the duty of the microfinance, because they have to deliver the best development they can for these countries, but also the best results they can for those they are choosing to do that. We think the OP can't just say, we'll just choose those where it's most productive to lend to a specific person, because that would just require greater and greater levels of bureaucracy, which will just raise the cost, and we are therefore not getting sufficient cost. We will have some level of this mechanism, but we think this is the quickest and easiest way of securing the efficient deliberation. Yeah, I'll take closing.
If men have much more established networks, is it more likely that they will get bigger returns from that financing and therefore create more development in that area?
Okay, that is actually incorrect. Why is this? Because if you're someone with a traditional base, you're able to maintain a certain level of income, and it can raise it a slight bit when you get this microfinance. And because the microfinance rarely leads to an incredibly successful job, it's not going to be a massive increase. Whereas a woman who would have no other means of economic opportunity, it's a much greater leap. I think it's the difference between 0 and 5 and 5 and 7. You deliver more marginal gain there. So how do we end up really changing this? Firstly, women gain more economic power because they're able to earn more because of the different roles. How's this important? Firstly, in short term, if they are able to say, I need to go about pursuing this job, therefore they can keep earning that income. Moreover, they may have be able to say, I'm able to succeed in this, so I can apply for other jobs, and therefore couldn't be oppressed by, say, entering a marriage with a husband, which is something they're required, because they can say, I still have my own economic base of capital, and therefore I'm not dependent on you, and so can move around. Moreover, in the long term, given they are able to think that they can succeed successfully as a business, they're more likely to invest in their daughters, and therefore we see more feedback education into the marginal. So we make up the economic growth of women, and therefore they're more likely to succeed in the long term. And therefore, the massive economic loss of acting like you've only got half the population you do is removed. Moreover, it allows you to get trust in future finance if you're able to succeed at this level. We think that given men already have a bit more trust in this, we think that it allows women to make up the gap, and therefore more people to get trust in future finance levels. Finally, often when women are going forward to microfinance, they may be discouraged from going for businesses they think the men would occupy, because due to their previous teachings on what men would and wouldn't do, they wouldn't assume that the microfinance people would give them fair treatment and therefore give them the same loan they would to a man on a man's business. Therefore, they will often drop out if they have potential business ideas, and therefore we see a massive loss in women who could be doing a good job in terms of business. Therefore, when men can't compete on this, they have no worry about that bias, and therefore are far more likely to come through and set up a viable business. These are these reasons we beg you pose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks, and now welcome the leader of the stage.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Speaker. All right, so we know that there are some, in developing countries, women's situation can be trapped, and they are likely to maybe at this point being in a marriage where they don't want to go. But we think what the government proposes there, they are trying to solve this problem with the wrong mechanism. We think that the way what they want to do, that they want to give cheap loans to these women, so with no interest rates to these women, but that actually they're gonna develop this into the wrong direction, so these societies won't be able to develop in the way that they should be able and when that development happens, basically, then the women would be more likely to fight for these situation what the government is seeking to achieve by themselves. We think it's more likely to happen if you're not just like, if you're not excluding men from these loans, because that's massively problematic, and I'm going to like argue on that. Why is it important that the men also should get these loans, and why is it so harmful if only women they're not getting these loans? And secondly, that's also that it's going to backlash, and then what they're saying that it's going to put in a role model situation that the women are going to be in that situation, and by that they will see that some gate openings going to be happening. It's actually not true, because there will be a vulnerability element by that, and women could be more alienated from this position. That's going to be my second argument. Okay, no, so like first, like just a few rebuttals before I would go on. So you say like, you know, like women like needs to be viewed differently. We think it's a like first of all, it's also bad logic saying like from the Western perspective it needs to be differently. We think they are better off if they're gonna view themselves differently by themselves. So we think it's better if they achieve like the society achieves a certain level when they will be more able to view them differently and not just like making like you should view yourself differently this way. So we think it's bad. Secondly, when they think about no, thank you, when like you know like men have so much more opportunities because they get education. We think it's wrong because we hardly heard any example on like versus like lots more examples are and how they are so better off just because they get some education. We think it's like very, very important to emphasize it again that we are talking about developing countries, and these developing countries, it's like extremely important to put them on the right track and make them be able to develop. So like that's what I'm going to focus in my first point. No, thank you, not yet. So we think like for a society and for an economy to function very well, if we are talking about developing countries, then we should focus on the economic growth. We should focus about that these people who are caring now about so much that I will be able to feed my children, I will be able to feed my family, and there is also culture should be boosted that like it's okay to make businesses and these individuals are encouraged and everyone in the society like at the same level will be able to create businesses, and by them like the whole society basically would be more pull the whole society like further on. And if you are like excluding half of the society like from this, then like altogether this development will be less. And especially if that you exclude the men part of the population, which is like they have the networks and they are a bit better off, and if they could be the ones who are pulling this society off. So like we understand that at the beginning we're sacrificing somewhat that like women as like we're not gonna have them put into the position, but we think it's like gonna help them better in the long run because there is an economic growth and like we're satisfying these needs, which are the basic needs, like to learn like make these people like to make themselves money and have businesses as a whole society and learn this culture, make these norms as a society. Like in the long run, they will be like more able to care about themselves. The discourse about like rights, the discourse about developing on further needs, and not just like how to boost businesses and not just like how to make money and feed my children. And if that happens, then the women also will be more able and more likely to make agency for themselves, and then they will be stand up, and that will be simply a more genuine change in that sense. And we think that also that's more healthy, right? So it happens in most of the developing countries. If you are fine with like economic growth, then you can simply have the time and have the interest to care about more situation, and that's when it's gonna start to happen. No, not yet. Thank you. Secondly, why is it like also kind of very much backlash, and it's not like happening if you open the gate, then like that will be fine. For the reason that like the vulnerability of these women like will be really, really high, because again, let me emphasize, we're talking about developing countries where the rule of law is simply not that strong. No, like these actors are extremely inexperienced. You're like targeting the individual, saying like you're helping these individuals, but you put them without any experiences into a very dangerous situation. Basically, like other businesses or criminal gangs, they can ask like protection money from them, and they will be actually like because there is not such a like well-established infrastructure among for protecting them, for like having business rules, they can be like very easily abused from like other business entities in the region, and by basically the experience what they get is going to be like a very bad one, and by that they can be like more likely to be the deterrent from this situation than like having good experience from that. Yeah, okay.
If by pure lottery of birth, men have more networks, have better education, and all the things that you mentioned, why is it fair for them only because of that to receive these loans rather than women?
Well, we think like everyone should receive these loans. What we're saying, if you're excluding men, you're making the development phase, like the development of this country, like incredibly hard. And we should like focus, because we're talking about developing countries, to make it possible that they grow. Like until they grow, like as long as they, like when they start to grow, it will be more likely that they can go to different direction. But if you just like exclude those who have a chance to build something in this case, like you are taking the more like people who are more likely to build something, it will be less likely that the country overall will be able to grow, right? And just like finishing the second point, like why is it so bad that like the women gonna get like these bad experiences for making businesses? So it's not just on the individual level how it's gonna happen, but also like because they like this would be a completely new situation from this experience. So they would create the norm. So also in the long run, basically what they would see that if you are in a women and being put in as an unexperienced actor into this situation, basically you will be worse off in the long run, because like the vulnerability factors you could be explored from different actors in the business area, and that's why we think it's very bad, and we want like the right track for development for these countries, and that's why I'm very glad to oppose.
The opposite for that fine speech now on the debt economy.
I'll bring you three major things in this particular speech. First of all, we'll talk about the long-term changes in the attitude towards women that we'll be able to achieve through this policy. Second, I'll talk about why it won't decrease the overall potential of these economies just by giving these loans exclusively to women. And finally, we'll talk about why it's the duty of these microfinance organizations to focus on women, because we think that they are the group that we can truly release as a potential economic development. Before we move on to those three things, let's begin with two bits of rebuttal. First of all, the idea of economic returns, and second on this idea of vulnerability. So first on this idea of returns, both in the opening speech and in the POI from closing, they basically came up and told us that basically because men are more likely to be able to achieve these economic returns based on the fact that they have large networks, therefore it's very unfair of us to basically exclude them as a group. But first we want to put this in context, right? Microfinance doesn't happen in cases where it causes sea changes in industries. It's not like once we give you these loans, it's going to increase like massive technologies in these countries and all those kinds of things. What it most likely does is it creates like little street businesses, for example, like fruit or sweeping the streets, public hygiene, all those kinds of things. Small little businesses. Now, when we only give this to men, or when we predominantly give these to men, maybe the impact is not going to be significantly huge. For the men who already have access to many of those kinds of economic pillars, for example, through manual labor, for example, through existing jobs, for example, through the education they've received, the massive difference that actually is created is probably not necessarily that big. The reason why we're focusing on women in these kinds of cases is because no matter how large the economic return actually is, according to their perceptions, we don't think it's actually going to be a sea change in these economies. The real big difference we can make, however, is when we give these kinds of money to the women. Because the women are the people who have no options on their table, who are currently not seen as financial pillars. These are the people who we can cause a sea change by raising the level, so that later on, when we actually have true development, the whole tide raises all boats instead of just individuals in these particular cases. That's why we think it's far better. If we're doing microfinance and judging purely on how much economic returns we can get, we won't be giving like small long-term loans anyway. We won't be giving them to these people anyway, right? Because if we're judging on economic returns alone, this is not a very good business to do. The real duty of microfinance organizations is to focus on how best we could use this money to unlock potential, to create new bases and platforms within these countries. That's why we think it's way better in these areas. Secondly, on the idea of vulnerability, right? First of all, they told us we can give it both to men and women, right? It's always going to work out. Now, we don't think that's true. When we give it to both men and women, we're reliant on the existing distribution networks. We're reliant on the fact that at the moment, all these resources are already distributed predominantly to men. That means even though we say that there's equal opportunities, there are actually in reality not that much of equal opportunities. What we're actually trying to do here is to equalize the playing field for them so that we can actually release the full potential of these kinds of areas. Now, Opening was very concerned with this whole idea of backlash. They basically said that lots of these women will be seen, first of all, as a very condescendingly seen as being raised by the government in these cases. We don't think it's true. And we give you these loans, not necessarily saying that the government's helping you reach the final goal. It's just saying we're giving you the resources to achieve what you want to do. It's still the women who are actually driving these business plans, who are creating these new ideas, running these businesses. To the outsiders, they see that it's these women who are making these kinds of changes, and they see that it's women themselves who are making this massive difference. So we think it's very necessarily true. More importantly, we don't think they'll face all those kinds of huge problems they face, right? We think that they'll mostly be working within their own areas in these regions, and we think it's far better for them, and they won't face the significant dangers they talked about. So let's move on to the three major things I want to talk about. So first of all, this idea of long-term changes in the attitude towards women, right? First of all, we think that we actually create lots of financial leverage within the family for these women. So initially, most of these women were suppressed with the fact that they don't have any kind of financial income. That means they have no leverage on their husbands when their husbands are oppressing them or forcing them to do particular things. What we do in this case is that we create them as financial pillars, allow them to run their own businesses, have their income, and therefore have financial leverage to increase their power within the family. Yes, ma'am?
So the problem with that, like, the husband will be still more likely to gain and like bring up from poverty that family. So basically what they're doing, you're reducing the chances within the society within the house.
Right, we don't think that's necessarily true, because initially women had no sources of income whatsoever. What's happening now is they can control their own money that they're earning from their own pockets. They're the people who are receiving the loans, they're the people creating the business plans, they're the people who are running the businesses. They can actually do this, so we think it's important. Now, as overall in society as a whole, what kinds of changes will we actually see? We think that because we are now portraying women as equally viable financial pillars. Now, we have to bear in mind that most of these developing nations, there exist perceptions that women can never be able to basically fulfill these roles. What we are necessarily showing here is that one, they can create their own business plans. They do have their own unique ideas. And more importantly, they have the managerial skills necessary to succeed in these cases. And we think it just shows the rest of society that these perceptions should change. More importantly, for the continent as a whole, or for these countries as a whole, what we are doing is unlocking a massive new workforce that we never had before. We're unlocking massive economic potential because of the fact that all these women who before were only caring about domestic issues within the home are actually released into the workforce and benefiting the economy as a whole. We think it's not just the businesses they're starting, but also the new roles they can now jump into that is most important. So we think it's good. Second major thing, why do we think it won't decrease the overall potential of these kinds of industries? First of all, we point out that even if we're just giving loans to these particular women, we don't rule out that there will be some cases where there will be things like joint ventures that actually happen. The only difference is the major decision maker will still be the women. Now, the key thing is this. Most companies at the moment, most of the companies or businesses will still be run by men. What we are guaranteeing is even when joint ventures happen, women have to be involved because they're the people who are receiving the loans. They're the people who develop those business plans, which means in the majority of these ventures, women now take a much more prominent role. More importantly, we think that the other sources of funding actually exist for most of the men. We already talked about how there's lots of other kinds of things like manual labor, the education they receive, all those kinds of things. So we think that we're not decreasing the overall potential of the economy in these cases. Finally, why do we think there's a duty of these organizations to do this? We think that most microfinance organizations need to focus on the idea of focused empowerment. Most of the aid we have at the moment, no matter in terms of developmental aid or in terms of humanitarian aid, rely on existent distribution networks. They basically say, I'm going to give you huge amounts of resources in these cases, and based on how culture is in these countries, they're going to distribute it in that particular way. Microfinance organizations have very limited resources, so they have to ask themselves, how best can we unlock the potential of these countries? How best can we build new platforms for change? And in this case, what they need to say is, we're going to unlock change by creating new groups that can actually benefit from us. All these people, the way the distribution network actually works, changes when we actually basically give them the new financial pillars they actually deserve. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are saying here is very simple. We think that in fact the returns will actually distribute across both men and women, because initially when we say equal opportunities, we're not truly raising both of these genders. In our policy, we are. We're very proud of returns.
Right, Mr. Speaker, what I'm going to try to do in my speech today is prove how the circumstances that opening government and opening opposition agree on actually underline the point of why these women in these particularly hostile environments can't achieve the kind of like unlocked potential and joint ventures, la-di-da, the Silicon Valley buzzwords that opening government talks about, right? Because we think that fundamentally in a situation where rule of law isn't upheld, in situations where there's hundreds of years of patriarchy instilled in people's, you know, like minds and their everyday actions and how they relate to others, etc., we think in those situations that you indeed have to be worried about backlash. We're not talking about backlash of the husband taking away the money. We're talking about extortion. We're talking about kidnappings and then revenge payments, right? We're talking about situations, this is what my partner was talking about, of situations in which there's actual physical harm, actual emotional harm, actual developmental harm inflicted upon these women because they've been put on the spot and because they've been supplied with this sort of like Western attitude of which way to develop. They've been given like a prescription of, you know, like, this is your way to develop into a capitalist economy, take it or leave it, right? We think that's fundamentally wrong, right? But also, let me just point to this contradiction that, no, thank you. Let me just point to this contradiction in government's case, where they keep talking about stuff like unlocking potential, right? The idea that once you have zero, if you go from 0 to 1, that's like an infinite percent increase, whereas if you go from 5 to 6, that's only X percent increase, right? I understand the logic. I still think that it's better to go from like 5 to 6 or something, because that marginal increase in, like, for instance, a patriarchally set up family's like income will actually help not only the empowerment of the woman by the Western standard that we uphold, right? But it will actually lead to, like, you know, the entire family in a very, like, you know, patriarchally trickle-down way achieve better life standards, right? And we fundamentally think that, and this is really important, is that there's this idea that these organizations exist to empower women first and foremost, right? No, we're talking about all aid organizations. We're talking about, you know, like development banks. We're talking about NGOs of all sorts. That specifically in the motion that we're talking about a whole set of these, right? Those aren't feminist organizations. The number one aim first is to achieve a minimum level of life standards, a minimum level of economic development where people, not just women, but people can actually claim agency over their own lives, and that pertains to men as well. Another misrepresentation in the government's case, which is that men have all these avenues of like economic, you know, like exploration and whatever, right? No, they don't. Like, I mean, this maybe applies if you're talking about like China or something, or, you know, like a 2.5 world economy, right? Like moderately on the steps towards development, right? But when you talk about the majority of cases where microfinance actually has an impact, such as sub-Saharan Africa, you see situations in which people's lives fundamentally are way down low. In those cases, it's not about unlocking potential and unleashing a whole new set of workforce, etc., because we're not in San Francisco, right? It's a situation in which people come from the bottom up. No, thank you. Come from the bottom up. In those situations, we believe that first and foremost, you need the development. You have to achieve a basic level of, you know, like, this is like hygiene theory. You have to achieve a basic level of like sustainable, like, economic development in order to actually then be able to equalize the actors in that development, right? We think in a situation where there is practically none, both for men, women, children, and everyone, it doesn't make that much sense to focus on women for largely, you know, like assumptive reasons of, like, you know, they probably want to get empowered by the Western standard, right? So, to reinforce some of the things that we've been talking about, right? Like, we think that fundamentally there's like this normative idea that women should be empowered more than, you know, like men. We think that that's not a given. We don't think that that has an inherent value. We don't think that fundamentally that actually contributes to women's empowerment, because we are still judging them by the Western standard. We're still judging them by the idea that financial empowerment, no thank you, is going to mean actual personal, like, you know, self-actualization and all that, that will be able to nudge them up Maslow's pyramid of needs because they employ the same pyramid. We don't know that. We can't know that. We shouldn't impose this kind of like ideology on them, right? We think that that's fundamentally important. Second of all, the mechanism of having more cumulative growth and more cumulative development, allowing that society's power structures, however oppressive they may be, to actually function and actually achieve like more income, more development, more welfare for more people before we actually engage in things like, you know, like civic activism or whatever on the part of, like, you know, women's rights, etc. We think that's more important. Furthermore, we think in this case, it's actually more important to allow these women to achieve those rights and those advances for themselves, right? We think if the aim is indeed the like normative aim of, like, you know, female empowerment, we think that it's much more sustainable and much more deeply rooted in those societies if those women can claim that kind of development and that kind of like agency for themselves, right? If you're like, you know, if you play into this like narrative of like the West is coming in and giving you like microfinance loans, etc., just a second, and, you know, that's why these women got empowered, we think that makes it unsustainable. We think that the learning mechanism of, like, you know, of society advancing and then women realizing that they're disadvantaged and then actually claiming agency over their own lives, we think that the learning mechanism is extremely important. In places where that learning mechanism doesn't exist, for instance, in situations in Eastern Europe, you do see cases of like unsustainable, you know, human rights issues and stuff. So in those cases, we do believe that it's legitimate to say that if you let these women do it for themselves, if you allow them to actually advance, once society in general has advanced, you get more good more of the time. Opening.
Okay, so they're probably going to be more long-term empowered if they've had access to capital for a lot longer, and we think this happens when they're able to take part in the economic growth because they've got the initial microfinance when they don't have the other means to access potential economic growth in the way men do.
Thank you. Okay, so on to our second argument, which is a direct response to that. Vulnerability issues, personal security issues. In countries where rule of law is not a given, you can't guarantee that women are going to be secure with that capital, right? And I'm not just saying this off the top of my head. There's plenty of examples of organizations like Kiva.org that actually crowdsources microfinance loans getting hugely ripped off and almost going bankrupt because, you know, like that one sewing shop in Kenya got robbed, they got extorted, they got protection money inflicted on them, right? But we have all these situations in these countries where we do have like tangible examples of women being abused because their only disadvantage isn't just like financial and economic exclusion. It's things like physical violence, right? It's things like not being able to leverage your social capital because you have a husband, right? Those situations, we believe, make it extremely hard for these women in those, you know, in situations where they're put in positions of power that they've never had the opportunity to experience, neither see like, you know, other models of like how those financial positions of power work. We say that in those situations, those women are indeed put on the spot, there are indeed vulnerability issues, and the conclusions that the community around them, for instance, draws from like what kind of experiences they go through, like for instance, business means you get extorted, or business means you get kidnapped, and then your relatives are being asked for like you know, ransom money to get you back, right? Which is situations we see like with Mexican migrants all the time, like when you put like one member of the family into a position of like economic achievement, the rest of the family gets ripped off as hell, right? We think in those situations, fundamentally, you have to think of the conclusion that that community will derive from those experiences. And we believe that like bad examples and bad understanding of like Western concepts, like for instance healthcare and the Ebola thing, right? We see that the bad examples and the bad conclusions that people draw impede further development and impede the exact same kind of like long-term things that opening government wants to achieve. So with regards to personal security issues, with regards to where these women are actually like placed in the power structures and in the economic development of their particular countries and particular societies, and with special regard to the extremely hostile environment from which they come from, we beg you to oppose because we don't believe that it achieves the aims of the government's case.
Welcome the member of government in second half of the First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, we think that in a situation where the governments and societies of these countries do not offer fundamental equality to 50% of citizens who live there, it is the duty of those NGOs, of those microfinance institutions to do so. Why do they have that duty? We think out of three reasons. The first one is we think that they generally have a duty to improve the lives of citizens there, which is why they offer those microfinance loans in the first place. Secondly, as I already pointed out in a POI, completely unresponded to, the advantages that those men gain are unfair and based purely on the gender they belong to rather than on something they deserve. And three, because the governments of those countries very often fail to protect those women. This is why these institutions have that duty. I'll talk about how this motivates women, how women are perfectly capable economic actors, and lastly about backlash. Before that, rebuttal. One, they tell us this could lead to a loss of productivity. We don't think that will happen. You see a lot of reasons why in our extension. But even if that happens, we think that is fair as long as the benefits are spread more equally. So we don't think that, say, a society like Angola, which has one of the highest GDPs per capita in Africa, but the most of that GDP is held by 80 people, we don't think that is a fair society nor a just society. We'd rather have a lower amount of money overall as long as it's spread more equally, and especially if it's spread to people who are disenfranchised based on completely arbitrary criteria. Then they tell us that we will lose growth because we can now not get microfinance them in. Firstly, recognize that more people seek microfinance so there is a bigger demand than supply of microfinance. So we still think that they will be able to give precisely the same amount of loans. But two, as I already said, the growth will be necessarily lost in the status quo. Look at countries like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia loses between 8 and 15% of GDP each year because they do not allow women to be powerful economic actors. The point of that is that even if a country gets to a relatively high level of economic development, like Saudi Arabia and a lot of other Middle Eastern states, they still won't include women because those norms which prevent them from entering the workplace and the economy will still remain there. Then they talk about development and empowerment. One, we tell you that the only moment when women can truly discuss empowerment is at a situation when they become powerful economic actors. Recognize that the Western feminist movement became the most powerful after World War I, when industrial production was contingent on women working in factories. At the moment when women can participate in the economic workforce, that's when they are more likely to get empowered. And then they tell us, yes, but they will only be seen as they get this money from the West. One, that could be an argument against microfinance in general. We don't think that a lot of people who take microfinancial loans are seen as people who are only empowered by the West. But more importantly, we don't see the comparator, because what they tell us is, at one moment, men will include them in the workforce. Why will they be necessarily seen as better if they get economically empowered by men rather than by the West? We fail to see how they win on that comparative. No, thank you. So, and lastly, they just tell us, yes, but these women can often be attacked, robbed, etc. One, that can generally happen in the status quo. Two, not all of them will. So even if it happens to some, a lot of them won't participate, won't get this. But three, that can still happen at any moment when they start entering the workforce. So they don't win on that. So what's the problem with motivation for women? As opening already pointed out, that they have a lack of education, the problem with labor, and the problem in inheritance. Well, we want to further on this. We tell you that often they're expected to work in the household. They're expected to get married very early, and they're expected not to participate in the broader economic workforce at all. What is the issue with this? This creates societal norms that women should not work and that they should be dependent on men and by and large stay within their households and get married earlier. How does this change? At the moment when they realize that they exclusively can get these loans. This is a powerful motivation for those women to try and seek these loans, because often they are afraid to compete with men precisely because of these senior social norms. Now this changes. Now they know that they have a safe spot and they can finally participate in the workforce. So why do we think they'll be equally capable economic actors? Opening largely assert this. Here are 5 reasons why. First, we think that the women who will be the most likely to take these loans were ones that were already previously considering it and had some business ideas. Why is that good? One, they'll be more likely to get tolerated because they're more likely to have a good business because they already had ideas. Two, they're more likely to employ women in comparison with men, which means that this benefit trickles down to a lot of other women, and these women can often get the know-how of running a business so they can start one of their own in the future. You get something of a trickle-down effect. Two, they have a vested interest in breaking stereotypes about women precisely because they suffer those things. Three, you can't just get a microfinance loan for nothing. You have to present the microfinancial institution with a relatively good and possibly profitable idea, so they won't just get loans out of nothing. Four, the businesses they start are by and large very simple businesses like agricultural production, so we don't think it's that hard to run such a business. Closing.
What is a bigger obstacle to a poor woman in the developing world? Being so poor that you cannot feed yourself, or being a woman?
I think that those two are often interconnected, because often they're so poor that they cannot feed themselves precisely because it is expected of women not to work. So, lastly, we tell you that not all businesses which these women run will interact with the general population. So say I take a microfinance loan to buy 10 cows. By and large, that will be sold to a milk factory, the milk I get from them. Those big businesses which buy from small businesses don't necessarily act discriminatory towards them. So a lot of those things won't happen. So backlash. Why won't it happen? A, if only women get microfinancial loans and not men, they can have comparatively cheaper products and businesses, which means that a lot of men will have an economic interest to interact with them, i.e. it will be cheaper to buy products from a woman who got this loan because her loan is cheaper, therefore she can afford a lower price. 2, this is not a huge amount of money so that people will get that pissed off. 3, a lot of men already get pissed off any time that women try to enter the workforce, and we don't see how that's necessarily comparative. 4, you can often provide reasons as to why you are giving these loans exclusively to women. Not all will understand it, but a lot of people will. Lastly, people who are already extreme and think that women shouldn't be in the workforce in the first place are ones that neither side of the house can win. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speakers for their contribution to the debate, and now welcome the member of
It's unclear to me, and probably to all of us, why the government believes that the same woman who has no source of income in the status quo also has the skill and knowledge to run a startup at the moment when they have a little bit more money. Now, the explanation to that is that we're talking about 2 groups of women in developing countries, right? We have, on one hand, the middle-class women, or the ones who are part of the growing middle class, right? First of all, for them, this policy is not necessary because they can already get these loans, they're already on the way. We are very happy to encourage more loans to them. We don't see why we need to crowd out loans for that particular group, right? But we also have the lower class women, the ones who are poorly educated, the ones who don't have other forms, and don't necessarily have other forms of income, right? They are the ones to all the harms we're going to talk apply. Those are the ones who are relevant because it's only in those cases where we seem to have a need to crowd out men. Their model of doing it is wrong. More importantly, their model will probably never really access them because the point when women will be competing with each other for these loans anyway, it is probably still going to go to the middle class women who already can access these loans only by encouraging more loans, not by excluding men, right? Also note for the comparative of this debate, right? I think it's very best expressed in terms of a family, like the families in the group that we're talking about, where we might have where it's very common that the only person in the family that has the skill of knowledge to create a startup in the first place is the man, right? They are probably very many at the point when they say that women don't get education and all those things, right? In those families, it is unclear at the point when starvation is a problem, where poverty is a problem, it is unclear why they will always have another source of revenue, where we're not taking them bread out of their mouths, where we're not harming them massively. No, thank you. So, in our extension, we're going to talk about three things, right? First of all, why women probably in most cases will not get access to that money. If they get access to that money, it will still create worse startups and less startups who will get less development. And finally, why in the case of the good startups, we're using women as pawn for our Western ideals, and that is morally illegitimate. No, thank you. So, first case, right, and this is something I haven't dealt with at all, right? They assert over and over again that there are structural problems and harms against women in these communities, right? Especially in the group that we are interested in talking about. Note that if that's true, there's nothing to prevent the husband in the family or the brother to actually use this money, to have the woman pass on the money so that he is in control and he is in charge. So all the benefits they bring about like why it is important to give women like a decisive role and for them to manage the business and so on, we don't see what that will happen in these kind of communities, right? Secondly, we probably know, thank you, the thing that women will be left with in those situations will be the loan, right? Even if they're low interest, there's something that has to be paid back anyway, right? At the point where a man who has used the money that his wife was able to get because of the loan feel that, hang on, I can't repay all this money, we're getting screwed, it's probably easier to just leave her to hang, and like her to dry, when, no thank you, leaving her to repay the loan rather than taking upon that burden, right? That's exactly, like in a nutshell, the vulnerability of women in these countries. We do not see why this solves a structural problem, so we get no liberation and we get an active harm in terms of leaving them, like putting them at this risk. However, we do accept that in some cases women will run startup business, right? Like we're not saying that this is all the cases, right? What happens in the case when they will do that, right? First of all, note that like development is very multifaceted, right? There will probably be some things that they can do. Like for instance, we hear in opening government that they'll probably be able to like run more food stands and so on, right? There's not a lack of that. So in terms of developing the community, getting lots of development in the community, we think it's probably very beneficial for the area as a whole to have existing businesses develop and become more sophisticated, become wider, maybe span more places, right? We think that that's probably beneficial for an area when, for instance, people can go together and use their startup money to I don't know, get more broadband, for instance, for already existing businesses, where the net development is bigger, right? That's the difference between going from nothing to something and going from something to more, right? That means on the net we get more development. We think more development is massively important because even if women aren't the ones doing that, at the point where they can access it, they can feed their families, and they get more money to spend, we think that at that point the women's development already happens, right? So we still think that's beneficial in the long run. No, thank you. Also, like, we think that these women will probably, like, in as much as they have to compete, we probably think that in communities where there are cultural and structural obstacles to women running businesses and interacting with other men, for instance, when the business rituals and the way of forming contracts are defined by masculine traditions, we think it's particularly harmful. We think it's more likely that they will be boycotted. We think it's more likely that people out of solidarity will support the male business when they think that the female and Westernly branded business is an alien concept, to support the ones that they feel are being unfairly crowded out, the ones who have had their business for like several generations and are now threatened by that. We think it's easier for men to gain solidarity and harm that. What does that mean? That means we had less returns for this investment. Compare that to when men create these investments, because at that particular point we think that they can use those networks to get even more traction. But finally, what happens when they are successful? Let's say there are a group of women who are able to transcend all this and create good, solid startups, right? The problem is that in these communities where it's already harmful, where there are problems, we've already heard from this side that they probably face resentment by people who can't get ahead, right? If people see that they can't get ahead and the thing that is that they would need to get ahead is precluded from them because of their sex, we think that will create a very strong motivation for them to harm these women, right? The most important thing to add here in our extension is that it is not only practically problematic, but it's highly morally wrong. When we're saying to families that need this money to get ahead, you can only do this if you expose one person in your family to all these harms. We are saying that we as Western countries find it more important to have your woman develop than necessarily having you get food on your table, right? This is morally illegitimate. Further, in particular, because we think that the women who assess that the structural harms are worse for them than the financial benefits of developing and running the business, or make a legitimate call, they're the ones who understand it, and because they understand it better than anyone else, we are massively happy to oppose.
May I? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 things to summarize this debate. A, why we think this policy is legitimate. B, how this impacts women. C, how the society will react, especially men. Before that rebuttal, firstly on productivity. We think productivity is introduced for 2 reasons. A, to achieve best outcomes. B, to be fair, because we think that who works the best should get the best award. We think that for being productivity, you need knowledge, you need networks, you need experience. Women have lack of all 3. Therefore, they've never really had a chance to prove themselves. They never really had a chance to show whether or not they can be productive, which leads to unfairness. And B, in terms of best outcomes, we can never be aware of the fact whether or not we actually missed some woman that could have been the best CEO, but we just never gave her a chance to get the things she actually needs to know in order to be productive. Now let's move on. Closing opposition talks about Western imposition. A, we think that this is not a Western imposition because these women, once they get the money, actually get to choose which job they want to do. Therefore, it's their own chosen Western imposition. But B, the opposition is here to tell us that both men and women should get the money. So if Western imposition is the problem, that's also going to happen by their model when both men and women are actually getting the money. Now, let's also talk about these kind of finances. We think that these microfinances do not go to middle class. Rather than that, they go to extremely poor people because they are the ones who need money. And number 2, we think that people coming from the middle class are the ones who are not interested in starting a small business. Rather than that, since they already have some sort of capital, they are interested into starting some bigger job. Therefore, microloans are not even good enough for them. Also, we want to say is that we do believe that not all women don't have knowledge because they were raised in developing countries. We think that some women actually do have the knowledge, but the thing that stopped them from being successful was the society that that never gave them money, never gave them contacts, never gave them the job. We think those women will be the ones who will start this kind of thing. We will think that those women will be the ones who will give know-how to other women who will need this. Now, also what we want to say is in terms of who's going to, how we control who gets the money. A, we can impose huge control and checks on the fact, do these women actually get the money and use them in the way they want? B, even if some women don't get the money and their husbands take them from themselves, we think that some women will actually get that money, will be able to become successful, and then impose bigger control and impose bigger sanctions in case of someone actually taking your money away. Also, in terms of more developing versus less developing, we think that it's preposterous to choose economic development rather than social development. Mr. Speaker, even if we accept the fact that men in a status quo can maybe create a more developed society, we think that that's not really a more developed society, because you have one entire group excluded from business, from success, from anything that regards anything out of the side of the house. We don't think that is actually a developed society. And we also, through my classes, I'll explain to you why they're not just going to go and buy men's products rather than women. Why we think this policy is legitimate. A, we think we are a society that tries to achieve equality of chances, is to give everyone opportunity to prove themselves. Women aren't equal. Practically, they're not equal. We think they should be in the kitchen. We think they should be beautiful. We think that they shouldn't go to school. We have wage gap. We don't like them to have jobs because they should be pregnant. Also, not just that we practically discriminate them, we discriminate them by perception. We think they're inferior. We think their place is not there. So what does that mean? That means that even if one woman has extremely good idea what should she do, she has a less chance to actually make that idea successful. Not because that idea is bad or because that idea is comparatively worse to man's idea, but rather than that because there is a perception they're inferior, there are no networks for that woman that she needs in order to push her idea, in order for her idea to be even more successful. What happens once we give them money? We do get that equality of chance, because now she gets to choose, I want to do this. She gets her agency. I want to start and I want to prove to the society that my idea is good. That leads me to the second thing that we need to discuss in this debate. That is impact on women and equality. Besides the fact that we have issues with perception and factual discrimination, we also have the problem with the fact that women in these countries aren't motivated to actually start doing something. So the first women that will probably start doing this are the ones that I've talked about in my rebuttal. The women that are actually capable but never get a chance exactly because society discriminates them. Do we think that these women will firstly break the stereotypes in our society because they will be capable to get the money, to invest that money, and to prove that their job can be successful? We think that is a huge benefit, because you will finally shut up that guy that says you are a woman and you're not capable. But also we think that these women will also motivate other women that can be capable and that can get knowledge, exactly because they prove to those women, yes, women can be successful when it comes to business. We think these women will be exactly the one who will give them job, who will give them know-how, who will prepare them to apply for those microfinances and then finally get the money. Two reasons why we think they will do that. A, solidarity. We think that groups that are being discriminated usually tend to help each other because they realize if we help each other, we have bigger chances to actually succeed something. Two, it's also self-interest. I'm aware of the fact the more women shows themselves to be successful, the bigger chances are for me to be less discriminated within our society. What do we get by that? Finally, equality of chances. Someone to provide education to that woman. Somebody to provide opportunities for the women with good ideas to actually prove their ideas is good. Number three, we think that it's not going to be like every woman can get money. No, you will still have competition between ideas. One woman will apply for money, other woman will apply for money. The better one is going to get the job. So you will still have that competitive market of the most productive ideas. Yes?
If a woman feels that, as you say, that society prevents her from getting ahead, why is your understanding of that difficulty better than her understanding of the threats and difficulties that face her?
Because the woman wants to achieve something, but she feels that society doesn't let her do that. Once we as a state impose that if she wants, she can always do something, she has a chance of A, proving other people wrong, or B, even if she alone believes that she is not capable, proving herself wrong, because she finally gets to dare to take that challenge and to prove everyone that they were wrong. But also let's talk about the reaction of society. So we're not going to talk to you how are we going to change extremely chauvinists that think that women are incapable. That's a minority. We don't really think that we can change them. But who do we can change? That middleman, Mr. Speaker. That man who doesn't really know why does he discriminate. Does he really discriminate? What's the problem with it? More reasons why we think. A, we think this is going to start a huge discussion between the people. Should we do this? Shouldn't we do this? We think that discussion can be very useful because you will finally hear the explanation of why are women discriminated, how are they discriminated, how this money can actually help them. Second thing, as we already said, you will have results. You will factually see that women were successful. Once you see that, you're losing your arguments of constantly saying women aren't made for business, they are made for kitchen. Three, we also think that some people don't even know that they are discriminating. They're not aware of the fact that they actually only have business contacts with men and not with women. Once this issue enters the discourse, you're raising awareness in the society about how serious this problem is and how unaware we are of that. We think that can be huge motivation for some people who wouldn't discriminate if they were aware of it, to change the way they actually behave. Also, even if none of this is enough, even if they're really going to be backlashing this idea, eventually they will quit. They will realize that we've imposed this policy and that this policy will go through. Once you accept the situation, you will just deal with it. Which leads me to the fourth reason. If men are so productive and so interested into getting money, once they realize that one woman can be capable and can be a good business partner, in order for him to get the money, he will probably cooperate with this woman in the end in order for business to be better. For all these reasons, proud.
We have faced a government bench today, Mr. Speaker, that thinks that microfinance can make historical and cultural tensions go away, that is sufficient for a woman to be accepted in their societies. We tell you that that is very clearly false. I'm going to talk to you about three things. Firstly, on the trade-off between liberating women and economic development, what is most important for these countries and within the duties of these NGOs and so on and so forth. Secondly, I'm going to win on both of those grounds. So firstly in terms of women, secondly in terms of development. So, jumping right in. Closing government tell us that we have a duty to prioritize women because we think it's less important for wealth to be, it's more important for wealth to be spread equally than for that wealth to be there in the first place. We tell you that that's invalid when the wealth being spread equally means that there is not enough for everybody. They also had to show us why it is legitimate to lock a family into poverty because only one member of that family can get a loan and the other cannot. We tell you that a poor woman is firstly concerned about being poor and secondarily concerned about being a woman. We tell you that it far limits her ability to self-actualize and her ability to sustain herself when her husband has no money to keep her, no thank you, for her to be fed, for her to have any reasonable quality of life whatsoever, for her to have any opportunities, especially given that we're talking about very little money in the terms of the opening government face it, right? We think that it's far more important to give that woman access to some money through her husband so that she can then empower herself in other ways. We think, no, especially, we fail to see why this is important when closing government recognizes that a lot of women are already entering the economic market. No, even if those are the middle-class women, no thank you, that already have opportunities, we think that there are steps towards it. We think it is immoral to hold the poor hostage to furthering liberal objectives. This is exactly the opposite of what the Western NGOs should do to further development. The West cannot put women in a situation of harm, no. They tell us, well, women get to choose, so it's not a Western imposition. Firstly, the men are harmed because there's things that are now denied to them, therefore backlash still happens, right? And you're still harming them. And secondly, you're putting women in a position of double pressure when their community is less able to develop, no thank you. And on the other hand, if they try to actually buy into this Western imposition, they are personally liable to harm and to massive backlash from their community. We think the West should not do that. That actually limits freedom. Now, on terms of women, Martin tells you in no uncertain terms that there are two groups of women that we're talking about. Firstly, there's a growing middle class that are already taking these loans because regardless of what opening government tells you, they are already accessible to women. We don't discriminate and only make it available to men, no. Secondly, there's the ones that we want to help, the ones that are the lower class women. And we tell you that the reason that they're not taking it right now is because they recognize that it's against their interest because of the backlash that would happen. This is the group of women that the government bench is trying to reach, right? This is the type of women that opening government describes when they talk about the woman that has no access to income whatsoever, that closing government concedes. Women in these contexts, nobody can help because those contexts have men that are not prepared to give up their culture, their like cultural beliefs or the cultural prejudices. No, that's when they say that they're not on either side of the house. What we tell you is that those are the women that if this mission has any impact, they're going to reach and why it's harmful for them. No. Firstly, two things can happen. We can get what opening government very nicely called joint ventures, where men in fact control the business, make all of the decision, and the women get no benefit. They say, well, the woman has to be there, so that's a benefit. But it isn't if everybody knows that the man is making the decision and if the man has to be there too. No. In fact, we tell you that it's very harmful and we got no response because the man now has the ability to leave, to divorce the woman if the company then goes into debt and leave the woman with that debt because the company was in her name. Leave the woman with a loan that she has to repay. No. no. That does not empower women, Mr. Speaker. But secondly,
Point.
no. Let's talk about the case where they claim that they're the strongest, the women that do in fact take over this business, right? We tell you firstly that there's no benefit to these women, Opening Government tell us that we create long-term incentives to educate women, ignoring existing cultural barriers where you would not want to do that, where you would not want to sooner take over the company yourself, or just boycott that individual company, right? We think that those are incentives that are far easier to do when you perceive women as less capable, less socially powerful. When you still need husband approval to sign contracts, we don't think that that changes perception. We don't think that having a small amount of money is enough to gain social acceptance. But importantly, what do we think are the harms that happen to these type of women? Closing Government concede that conservative communities continue to exist, that these norms happen where women are, yeah, all right, you did. You said that these are the ones that we can't help on either side, right? When these norms do exist, and when women are perceived as less capable and inferior, when there are cultural and structural reasons, such as them not having access to education, where you think that they're inferior, you will, on the best case scenario, boycott these businesses. On the worst case scenario, in a second, in the worst case scenario, things happen like Malala. We know what happens when women try to push themselves ahead at the expense of their cultural beliefs. No, thank you. And we think it's immoral for the West to put women in those positions when they have less agency and they're subject to harms, to things like acid attacks, to things like their fundamental rights being ignored. Closing.
If you were listening to my summary speech, you would have heard that I gave 4 reasons why men will not quit upon this. Also with the fact that my partner mentioned cheaper prices and all of those kind of things.
Right.
Respond to that.
I'm going to get into that. Let's talk about development, and we'll come to this at the end of this point. So, to deal firstly with Opening Government, because they had this misconception that I want to deal with. They said that only men have access to this. Now I've already told you why it's true, and that this money also makes a minimal difference, but it's important in terms of mobilizing the workforce. If it is true that this makes a minimal difference, given that they're also available to women in the status quo, and given that, as they tell us, men have access to all these other networks, it's unclear why men would accept them in the first place. We don't think that that's the comparative right now. We don't think that it's about mobilizing the workforce because that assumes that there's jobs for everybody and opportunities for everybody. What we tell you is that you have limited loans that you can offer and they can in fact make a difference. So therefore it's important that we use them well. Like men and women are not necessarily going to get other alternatives for developing themselves, right? And secondly, that's it. Right. So 3 reasons why we tell you that it won't happen. We tell you that there's going to be less startups or worse startups. It's simply the case that you have less competition. If you shut off half of the market and focus on people that don't have education, that have no buy-in because of the cultural norms that also affect them. Women are also going to perceive themselves as less capable to go in. Cultural norms still exist, right? And also, if you have some criteria, which you presumably have, that means that there's for these startups, that means that there's less startups that you can even start to consider, right? So you get less competition, so you get worse things, which is important given that Closing Government told us that good ideas are important and not just any startup, right? Secondly, structural problems, exactly the reasons that Opening Government told us, women not having education, not having networks, being judged for deprioritizing their family means that you don't get buy-in and you don't get success. But importantly, even if Closing Government are right about these structural problems not being that important, the fact that people are willing to boycott it still remains. The fact that these cultural norms remain and they're so willing to accept that in the cases that this debate hinges on means that it doesn't happen. They said it's cheaper. 1, norms trump things being cheap. 2, this is marginal if we are talking about as little money as you are. It's either that or you get no resentment. And lastly, business without a startup have all the other benefits that you've talked about, so those are also going to be cheap. Mr. Speaker, nothing of the government case stands in this debate. Closing opposition.